Fred Labbe from Expedition, water engineer, and this is Kirsty.
Hi, I'm Kirsty from Periscope. We're coordinating the master planning and also doing design of the landscape and public realm.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the river, the fluvial flood strategy, and the pluvial flood strategy. So really talking about the flooding issues and how we mitigate that within the master plan. So I would love to live by the river. I would really like to have this sort of view when I take my breakfast, imagining living here. That would be a fantastic thing to live by. The river is a fantastic ecological corridor with a very rich mix of habitats. In the tidal zone, you've got very frequent wetting and brackish water. Then you get another type of ecology as you go up, and you're less frequently submerged. Then you got drier ecology further away. So the river really is a rich ecological corridor. The river is also obviously a great amenity that can be enjoyed gently in many different ways, or also with great fun. So this is, as you probably know, the Lewis to New Haven raft. I don't know if any of you are on this picture, but this looks fun. I haven't done it, but it looks fun. The river, unfortunately, is not always the best neighbor. And I know that a lot of you have witnessed the very big flooding events and have lived it firsthand. And this is something that we are taking very seriously, and we've been engaging with the Environment Agency, East Sussex County Council, and Southern National Park Authority to come up with a way to protect the site and the wider development, the wider neighborhoods. Flooding is predicted to get worse with climate change. We've all heard that sea level will rise, but not only that, rainfall will become more intense. There'll be greater flow coming down the river, and a lot more water falling on the site. So all of those are challenges that we are tackling. And then the last element I would like to just introduce, we also know that, I don't know if you know, but that there is a severe water stress in this part of the country, in particular because of population growth, over abstraction on the aquifers, but also climate change. So climate change will bring more stress on the water resources. So we'd like to propose as a vision, you've heard Jonathan talk about an exponentially sustainable development. We want this to be also nurturing and celebrating its relationship to the river. That's part of the DNA of this place. We want it to focus on very careful management of flood risk and thinking about the long-term client resilience. We want water to not only be seen as a nuisance that you have to get rid of. Water can play a role in placemaking and enhancing the local ecology. And then lastly, we want to tread lightly on the earth and have the smallest possible water footprint. But Kirsty will talk about how that translates into the landscape.
Yeah, so Periscope have been working very closely with Expedition and with the flooding and the sustainable water requirements and how that can translate into a fantastic place. And so we see all of the issues, but also the kind of constraints, I guess, that Fred outlined, also as opportunities for enhancing what already exists in Lewis and bringing really strengthening the relationship to the water. So you can see some of these images. We're really keen on bringing the water of the riverfront back to Lewis for it to become this kind of frontage, a public frontage, for it to become an ecological and a social backbone for the area, for it to create these routes in terms of walking and cycling, obviously the ecology, and for it to kind of play a central role in the social infrastructure of the future of Lewis. And you can see some of the ideas that we have, which we'll go into in a bit more detail, about creating this continuous promenade, creating a variety of experiences and conditions, relationships with the water, some that serve more ecologies, aquatic and marginal planting, some that more serve social or movement or visual functions. So we're really keen in bringing that kind of narrative of the whole wider river into the new kind of fabric of Lewis. So I'll go into some more detail about the specific designs for places as we talk through the presentation, but this kind of shows the blue network, which is very much integrated in placemaking through sustainable water reuse, through flood management, and through this kind of very sort of backbone of the river, and how that will also underline the green ecological strategy. The dark green arrows show key green connections. So, for example, at the moment, there's a kind of piecemeal arrangement of habitats or planting along the water. We're looking to strengthen that. So this kind of green arrow is showing that creating this continuous connection. We're also looking at borders and how we can work with the existing woodlands and with the recreation grounds, and again, kind of bring them into the urban fabric.
So let's look at the Fluvial flood management strategy, which is really the big piece. This is a flood map from the Environment Agency that you've probably seen. It does show that a big part of the site and a big part of the wider area fall in flood zone 3, which is subject to flooding for the 100-year event. And part of the sites are in flood zone 2, which has a 1 in 1,000 year probability of flooding. We know that this map is not just a map. We know that this happened recently in October 2000. So we know where the flooding was. So we don't only have prediction, we also have records. We've been also looking at the topography, so it's quite important to understand that the site is relatively low-lying in relationship to Lewis. So Lewis is higher, obviously. We have level of 4 to 5, 5.5 in places. So it's relatively low, close to the river. We've been working, as I said, with the Environment Agency on reviewing the condition of the existing flood defense. So there's a mix of different flood wall codified by the EA with different typology, with different conditions. Most of them are in poor condition, as you probably know. Some of them are got trees growing through them, and they're not really fit for purpose. They're also not at the right level. So in 2000, they were overtopped. We also been, as I said, we've been having 3 workshops with the Environment Agency, and we're going to continue working with them throughout the development of the project. We're really working with them on supporting what we do on their modeling. So they've done a lot of modeling. Since the flooding in October 2000, they've been modeling the river to develop a flood mitigation strategy, not only for this site, but for a lot of other places along the river catchment that were flooded at the same time. So we've been working with them to understand the parameters that we need to work to. And we've agreed that we would design the flood defense to provide a level of protection of 100 years with a 45% allowance for climate change. So this is a 45% increase in river flow. And when you consider the catchment of the river, this is a big increase in discharge through the river that we are factoring in the design. So the predicted level is 5.85 above sea level, meter above ordnance datum. And we are designing with a freeboard of 300 mil on top of that. And then as part of the strategy, we're not only going to protect the site, but we're also going to protect Pelham Terrace and Talbot Terrace, and I'll come to that in more detail. So the strategy, in a sense, I will come to each section in detail, is to upgrade the existing flood wall around the site to the level of 6.15, design the flood defense for 120 years, so long-term resilience. There will be a couple of floodgates at the end of Brook Street to not affect the access to the Pells. North Street and Brook Street. There'll be a floodgate as well, so the flood wall will come against the old stone wall, and there'll be a floodgate there to close that. There will be a floodgate here to get visual access and access to the river. And there's potentially another floodgate here where we've been talking with the boat club about potentially having a slipway and a place to launch a boat. This is not yet agreed, but this is being considered. And then we're also looking at putting a flood defense to the front of Pelham Terrace, which were badly flooded as well in 2000, closing the end of Talbot Terrace, which was also a route for the water to come back. And then, I don't know how many of you remember the Santon scheme, the previous scheme. The flood defense was running along here and closing here, so effectively the Lido, the Pells Pool, and the recreation ground were behind flood defense. We had a number of feedback and discussion with the people from the community here, and there was concern about having a very tall wall that would separate from view the recreation ground from those houses, a 3-meter tall wall, so we decided to not have a big flood wall here. We also didn't want to take down the old flint wall along the Lido, which is a nice historic feature, so we didn't want to take that down. So instead of having the flood defense here, we take the flood defense at the back, and we're going to increase the level of protection with a couple of floodgates, but not to the full 100-year level, but just working with the existing wall to raise the level of protection on the Pells Pool. And lastly, this approach effectively puts back the park in the 100-year floodplain, which it's logical, it makes sense. You don't want to protect the park. The park is meant to be in the floodplain, it's a green space. And then lastly, on the concept, if you think of the site at the moment at 4 to 4.3, we have a flood wall that varies in height. At the moment, in most places, you can see over the wall. If we bring the wall to 6.15, there will be many places where you'll be behind a 2.5 meter high wall, you won't see the river. So one of the key things we've looked at, and Kirsty will take you through the section, is to elevate the walkway at the back of the wall so we have a connection to the river.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do now is basically walk you through a series of sections of what all of those translate to in the spaces that we're looking to design and what the experience of that would be. So I'll start with just saying that these are kind of working progress that we're discussing with Expedition, with the EA, and also through consultations such as these. But as I said before, then the kind of main aim is to create this diversity of waterfront experiences, both ecologically and experientially. So if we start, we're going to start at the bottom of the site. And this is a photograph of the existing wall. As Fred has outlined, it's not sufficient to defend against the EA's requirements for future flooding, and you can see it's also in a state of disrepair. It does have some ecological value. The ecology reports that we have so far aren't saying that that's great, but you can see as you walk along kind of the recreation fields opposite and Tesco's, you do have this kind of green border and then the wall above. And so this is a section through the proposal and how the levels that Fred has described will translate spatially. And so, as I said, this is the bottom of the site. And so you can see at this level we're quite low down, but as the walkway will ramp up to this 7.2 level. So at the beginning it will be much lower, but as you go up then you'll kind of have this progression to see over the water level. And then you can see that a key part of this is the ecological kind of enhancements, so creating this green buffer and working with the edges of the river. So yes, these three show the low tide, the mean tide, which will come about here with the marginal planting, and then the 1 to 100 year plus 45% climate change will be here. So you may have seen the model in the space, which shows a kind of idea of the layering of these, the ecology towards the water, and then the wall and the kind of level that you'd be at the top looking over this wall. And something that we're really keen on doing is there's obviously the existing wall isn't performing as well as it needs to, but there's something in the grain of it. It creates these niches, it has a very kind of expressive articulation, and there's a real sort of heritage in the use of materiality in the wall at different points. So rather than us kind of knock the whole thing down and start again and end up with something quite clinical and hygienic, we're looking at really working with the materiality and using the existing wall to create the formwork for the new wall. So you can see what we kind of experimented in with in our studio in the last weeks was actually using some of the existing wall as formwork to cast the new wall. So you really get that kind of use of history and heritage and the existing in the proposal. Okay, so then if we move to the second section, so we're now here in the center. You may have seen the model. This is where the bridge will connect across the river to the other side where Tesco's is. And this is the existing condition of the wall. Again, it's in quite a poor state of repair. You can see, though, the difference in materiality. It's brick here. There's quite a lot of trees growing through it. And at this point, so the walkway from lower down has now reached the top of the Belvedere. So this is kind of the Belvedere, and this creates a lookout point and also an entrance into the existing Foundry workshop. So this is really an opportunity to connect the existing buildings out to give the Foundry workshop a waterfront aspect and a public space that will actually sit and look over the water. So this whole thing is happening at higher level. And then again, you'll see the terracing going down, so creating banks to allow the silt to deposit and to allow kind of new planting and new sort of habitats to emerge over time. And this, again, you may have seen the model in the exhibition, but this shows an opportunity where the section that I took, the people were actually standing along the top there, but underneath there's quite a significant drop, and that actually creates an amazing opportunity to connect the public space with the water. So we've shown in this vision that you'd have these arches, and you'd actually, when you're in the public space, you'd have this view through these glimpses of the water. And again, the idea of a jetty or some kind of, you can actually be at the level of the water with potential moorings or kind of activities. So the activities would really spill out towards the water. And then the final section along the river looks at the top. And so you can see the existing wall gets a bit lower. There's quite a lot more kind of planting in these sandbanks and undercutting of the embankment. And so here again, we've gone for a third typology to increase the variety and to sort of create this progression as you go up the river. And so at this point, the flood defense wall is actually built in as part of the building. So you'll see here, the floor level is creating these private terraces that will look out to the water. So you have a kind of third typology where people will actually have aspects and waterfront kind of gardens. And then the public access will be at lower level through a floodable boardwalk. And so this is kind of a more meandering kind of domestic or sort of relation to the South Downs and to the woodland in the north. This is much more kind of naturalistic experience. And again, you can see this opportunities for connection to the water. And so this is a kind of conceptual model about how that could work. There could be, again, it's something we're working with the EA with, but potentials for jetties or kind of areas where it interacts with the islands or with these kind of planting at low level. So in a way, you kind of have this very thin strip of water park. And then this shows the combination of all of them. So you have this dynamic riverside walk, this articulation of going up, down, of having these cranked areas where you could have terraces for ecological planting, points of lookouts and intensified ecology, and then this kind of framing of new views across the water. And also, again, to bring your attention to the bridge connection, which will make a sort of shortcut and very kind of important sort of viewing point through the urban fabric. And so then we're moving over into the Pells border. So we're now kind of at the other edge, looking at the existing wall there and this kind of boundary between the woodlands. And the proposal here looks at keeping the existing wall as is, and then we'll actually create the flood defense wall set behind that. And offset so that we'll be allowing an area of planting so that what you would view from that pathway would be the wall as existing, and then you'd have this kind of green border. So rather than it being kind of starting from scratch and having a very tall edge, that edge wouldn't change, but it's a much kind of softer approach to connecting the two sides. You can see from this is a zoom in of the green network kind of strategy that we were looking at, and how it's in general a kind of feature to have much more of the green existing woodlands, the South Downs, that all really kind of permeating the urban fabric at this point. So creating this very kind of green border between the woodland and the development. And then moving down, so this is the last section that I'm going to talk through, and this is a condition towards the Pells recreation grounds. And so the existing condition obviously is that we have these fields and the brick wall that surrounds the Lido. And here we have a lot more space because we're not creating this kind of defensive sort of monolithic wall along there. As Fred describes, then it's about really keeping that border quite open. And so we'd look at having a more of a soft kind of bund approach, so that it would be just with topography sculpting, you could actually keep the views, keep the connection, keep the public access through from Pells Recreation Grounds to the urban fabric.
And this is also with a lesser carbon impact, so the embodied carbon of that is a lot less than a wall. We would have a clay core, like good dam design, but I think this is a much softer solution that we can do in that place because we have the space.
And again, you can see the kind of it's less of a woodland strategy, but more of an idea that you'd keep that border open, that it would be kind of inviting public access to come through from the recreational ground, potentially all the way through at points to the waterfront. So really creating this permeability.
So we've spoken with a lot of you about what we're doing on the Pells front, on Pelham Terrace. So we'll go a little bit more in detail on that. As I was saying, we didn't want to take down the old flint wall and rebuild it to 6.15 as in the previous scheme. We also didn't want to have, again, a 3-meter wall here that would completely disconnect the play space on the recreation ground from the houses. So I think a lot of you voiced those concerns. So we really took that on board with the new strategy of taking the flood wall at the back of the recreation grounds. So we've been discussing with the Pells pools as well. So we're not going to just leave it as current. We are going to put a couple of floodgates, actually 3 floodgates. There'll be another one here to the plant room. And this will work with the existing wall and the existing capacity of the wall. So the flint wall can take some water, but it can't retain 2 meters of water, but it can take a meter of water. So this floodgate will effectively create a continuous defense, but at a lower level. So it will protect the Pells pool and the recreation ground to a 1 in 30 year level of protection. So instead of flooding every 5 years and having a big cleanup job, that will happen only every 30 years. So this is, to me, this is really fine-tuning the flood level of protection, the level of protection to the land use. And then when we come to this is quite similar to the previous scheme because they had a good solution with a combination of permanent defense, so a parapet wall at 6.15, and then as the level drops, we didn't want to have a tall wall on the edge of the streets. So we have this Dutch dam-in-dam system, which is effectively a parapet wall at 4.85, which passively gives a level of protection of roughly 1 in 30, 1 in 40. And then in the top of the wall, you have a trough, a lid, and all the elements of the demountable defense are hosted there. So it's quite easy to open the lid. I think I've got another picture. Open the lid, take the vertical support, slot them in, and then put the panels, which seal against each other, and get a continuous defense in a couple of hours. So the idea would be that there would be a flood warning from the Environment Agency, and that those panels can be installed relatively quickly. When we come to the end of Pelham Terrace, where we join St. John's Hill, we'll have the same system, but instead of being hosted in the top of the wall, it'd be hosted in the street. So that the same system of different components that can work across the street. And that will give that continuous line of defense like this. So, oh, sorry, one too much, one too many. So you'll have the system in the parapet wall here, and then you'll have the system in the street here. So you get a continuous level of protection. So at the end of Talbot Terrace, the railway is effectively a route for the flood water. It's subject to flooding. It's in the floodplain. And in October 2000, some water also came from this end into Talbot Terrace. So what we're proposing is to have a bund here. This is very similar to the previous scheme. Have a bund here that effectively close the end of the road to floodwater. So that will effectively create a continuous defense around Pelham Terrace, which has been subject to flooding. We can move on to the drainage. So this is really dealing now with, not with the river, not with the fluvial flooding, but with the storm water from the site, so the rain falling on the site. So this is the site at the moment. A lot of it is currently impermeable. Part of it, a big part of it drains to the river through existing outfalls, but part of it also drains to the combined sewer system, which then get pumped and sent to the wastewater treatment works. The combined sewer system, as you probably know, was upgraded after the 2000 flood, and Southern Water installed a big stormwater relief tunnel, 10 meters below ground, running there, and this basically provided a lot of extra capacity to, one, deal with sewer overload, and also reduce the frequency of pollution events of combined sewer overflow into the river. So this is already installed and has been in operation for 15 years. So in terms of drainage, we've been looking at best practice sustainable urban drainage approach. And probably some of you already know about this, but this is really looking at the four aspects. So we talked a lot about water quantity and flooding, very important, but equally important is water quality. As we're going to take the water to the river, it's very important that we deal with urban pollution and we remove pollutants before it gets to the river. Amenity and biodiversity are equally important. How can you integrate the water elements in the landscape, in the public realm, in the placemaking, and importantly trying to support biodiversity. As we heard, we've got a climate emergency, but there's also a biodiversity emergency. So this is really fundamental to try and get any opportunity to improve the ecology. So all that stuff was general good practice. What does it mean for this site? We've defined six fundamental principles, and I'll take you through one by one. The first one is to find the most sustainable route for disposing of surface water. So there is a hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy is putting the water into the combined sewer system, because that puts extra stress on the sewers. That water needs to get pumped, treated, and probably pumped again. So there is a big carbon footprint about putting water in the sewer. The best thing we can do on this site is to take the water directly to the river. We've got the river next door. And we've been discussing with East Sussex County Council and the EA. We don't really need to restrict the peak discharge, but we need to be very mindful about controlling erosion and velocity and the impacts on the river ecology. So that's one of the things we're doing. We're taking away, we're not putting any water in the combined sewer system. The second aspect is flood resilience. So when the flood happened in October 2000, it was first the sewers that were backing up. The river was high, the water was coming through the sewer system and could not discharge to the river. So it was starting to flood through the manholes, through the gullies. So that's one key aspect. And we still have the same issue because the site is below the flood level. So that there will be times, and there are times, where the system cannot discharge to the river. So we need to provide some holding capacity to hold the water and wait for the river levels to recede until we can discharge. The second aspect, the way we're approaching that, we've been talking to the Environment Agency and East Sussex County Council, who are the lead local flood authority, to really understand in quite some level of detail the probability of having combined tidal events with a fluvial event on a storm on the site. So those things are independent or semi-independent. I mean, the fluvial and the storm are related, and it's really trying to understand, combining those different events to come up with a series of scenarios that we test to find the right amounts of holding storage. But then, in terms of flood resilience, we're also looking at the bigger picture of how the site relates to the higher ground in Lewis. And we know that from experience and from this analysis that there is a contribution in heavy storms of surface water runoff down North Streets and down the other streets onto the site. So this will create some extra runoff that we have to deal with in being resilient to flooding. We really want, and this is some of the work we've been doing with Periscope and Kirsty and the team, is really looking at holding that water in a way that offers multiple benefits. And it's always very useful to talk with a negative example. So we don't really want to do this. That's a solution. But that has a very big embodied carbon impact. And that doesn't really offer anything. Having a big tank that sits empty in the ground and just fills up and does its thing when you have a big storm. We don't really want to do this either. Something that looks a bit like a motorway balancing pond where you almost want to put a fence around. We want to do something where we think about what happens when there is no rain. We want to think about the different frequency of water levels, the water level regime, and how we can integrate that in those features. So what we're looking for is normally a permanent water body that supports the ecology, supports the amenity. It's part of the landscape strategy. We have a 30-year design event, which is the drainage design event where you don't want to flood. So the capacity for this will be provided in some sort of marginal wetland attached to the water body. And then there is the extreme event in terms of drainage terms, which is 100-year plus 40% increase in rainfall intensity, where we effectively look at ways to deal with that in the landscape. So some of the public square, some of the roads, perhaps, some of the green space will be flooded but in a controlled manner. And this is really best practice. It's really providing the storage you need for what you need, but not oversizing and dealing with the extreme events in a sensitive way and carbon efficient way. And then, this is an example of this sort of features. This is in London, so we're not talking about such tall buildings, but I think it's this sort of water feature, a linear type of water feature, where you have the permanent water, some marginal wetlands that can flood, and then this was connected to another bigger park at the downstream end. So this sort of features, and Kirsty will show a few other examples. Source control and pollution control. So this is really trying to think about what can we do at source to minimize the runoff. So if we have buildings and hard-standing surfaces that basically create runoff, what can we do to avoid the runoff in the first place? And what can we do to control pollution? So we have a wide palette of things we can do, and they're all anchored in best practice. So you've got porous pavements that basically take the water to the ground, reduce the runoff. You've got all these elements which you can fit along roads, corridors, and they slow down the runoff, they clean the runoff before it gets to the drainage. And there's plenty of very nice example of these sort of features that we're looking at integrating along the streets, in the courtyards, and Kirsty will show a few of those things. And then lastly, going back to the question of water scarcity in this part of the country, what can we do in terms of reducing the water footprint of the development? So looking at ways to harvest rainwater. Those drainage features that we're going to create, those ponds, they offer an opportunity to get some water for some of the allotments and growing use that I think you've heard about in previous talks. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on food growing allotments, rooftop allotments. All of that will need water. Are we proposing to use water, harvest rainwater from some of those features? We're proposing to use a new technology. It's new in the UK, it's been used for quite some time in the US and in the Netherlands, and it's a smart system that takes a feed from the weather forecast, the real-time rainfall monitoring, and makes a live decision whether to keep the water or to release the water. To keep the water when we've got dry weather being forecast, when we need the water, and to release the water when we know there's a big storm coming and we need to make space to hold the storm. That can also be linked to telemetry, so we've got a river gauge just here, so we can also link that to that. We can link that to water quality, irrigation demand, so it's a very smart system. The beauty of it is that conventionally rainwater harvesting is a big tank in the ground, plastic tank, with a lot of extra kit to get the water. That has a carbon cost. And normally the rainwater harvesting needs to be separate from the stormwater tank because there's a conflict of usage. This one wants to be full all the time, this one wants to be empty. With this active system, we can effectively get both use out of the same storage component. And it's a very innovative and carbon efficient way of harvesting rainwater without the material penalty cost. And this is just a view of the whole system, so basically adding the sort of circularity of the water with the harvested water going back to the allotment on the urban farm.
So I'm just going to talk, this is kind of the final section, but talking about how some of these strategies are integrated with the placemaking and the kind of formation of spaces. So this, another plan, I'm afraid, but this is our Pluvial attenuation strategy. So this is the kind of looking at how those attenuation areas can actually be deployed on site and kind of what the strategy for that is. And you can see it's composed of a number of elements. For example, there'll be the blue shows the North Street and how, for example, we'll be working with SUDS features and permeable paving. And then the kind of general strategy is Fred outlined that we're working with the 1 in 30 event and then the extreme event, which is the 1 in 100. So the 1 in 30, we're looking at providing attenuation areas in the softscape public realm, so in pocket parks and in the, green areas that are public. And then for the extreme events and where extra capacity is needed, then they'll be provided in the communal kind of private green spaces. And this kind of gives an idea of what sort of areas we're talking about with them. So you can see the squares inside are showing areas where we'll actually be creating these kind of lowered attenuation green spaces. So we're going to be working with topography and with creating this series of wetlands, permanent standing water, kind of seasonal wetlands. So it really forms part of the, again, the ecological system and the softscape design. And so part of our research that we've done is looking at how the Ouse floodplain works. and looking at a number of different strategies kind of on a large scale that we can also then start to think about how they can be deployed on a smaller scale to create the spaces and the attenuation that we need. And there are kind of a number of strategies that we can use, for example, creating localized wetlands or condensing all of the attenuation area into a deeper lake, creating perimeter swales or kind of longitudinal areas. So we've been kind of looking at different topography formations and how that can help inform spaces or where that makes sense depending on different size constraints and different kind of program areas and ecological opportunities across the site. So I'm just going to run through a kind of few examples of what those spaces look like and where they would be. So this one is looking through one of the example of a courtyard space and how you can have the floor level, sort of finished floor level with the buildings as is, but you start to kind of dig down and create this undulating topography with kind of key paths and routes that will always be accessible no matter what kind of flood level we're at, and then areas below which will either have permanent water in or be a combination of seasonal kind of wetlands or seasonally floodable areas. And this is an example on plan about how this can actually start to form a really playful kind of dynamic landscape, how you can start to have articulated bridges, kind of islands, woodlands, marginal planting areas. It's kind of, again, similar to the river strategy, creating as many sort of habitat opportunities as possible, as many conditions with both permanent and temporary kind of areas of water. And just a couple of examples of what the kind of experiential value. This is a project in Copenhagen, which is completely floodable. And again, you get this idea of the wild. It's incredibly green. It's this sort of integrated play space, the idea of stepping stones, and the types of habitats that you can create very much relate to that water and kind of idea of how wet or how dry these areas are. And this is it's actually another Copenhagen example. I used to live there, so I'm very into their public spaces. And this is quite a beautiful one because you can see it's much more articulated. You can really see this bowl shape, but it's also incredibly playful, and you can see how it almost, those constraints create, again, opportunities for play, for kind of interacting in new and kind of more organic ways. So again, when we're thinking about play, it's not necessarily creating a playground with a fence around it, but actually using sort of more natural and infrastructural kind of functions or opportunities. And then this kind of shows how we can do something in a much smaller space and how that can interact with the hardscape. So you can see, for example, the streets with the permeable paving and that creating this edge, again, of quite a potentially wild or wet woodland type softscape design. And then again, this looks through another sort of example of this topography, but this time how it can be integrated in also more of a hardscape. So we actually have sacrificial public spaces as well as green areas. And again, that kind of works with different habitats and different planting strategies. And then the streets, these will be a much kind of smaller scale approach. We'll be using permeable paving everywhere and then have these areas of suds, rain gardens, which will be kind of smaller areas of green, but will all be connected underneath to allow kind of big planting and big tree pits for larger trees. But it will be a much kind of more urban typology. So you can see this kind of integration between, again, allowing the runoff to go through the paving, areas of drainage, and then this is showing a swale or kind of rain gardens. So you have these smaller sort of scalar approach down to actual junctions. And so kind of thinking about, obviously, there's the heritage of cobbles in Lewis and this sort of meeting with the green, and so areas where we can actually use the junctions between things to create opportunities for water to infiltrate. Again, in a very controlled manner, but it really goes down to the material kind of scale.
In this case, we've been working with the Environment Agency, who are looking at the whole catchment, so not only this site, not only the Tesco site, not only the cliff site, but the whole of the river catchment. And they have been studying this catchment thoroughly since the October 2000 flood, and in discussion with them, we have discussed what would be the impact of the flood wall on our site And their response was from them, the modeling work they've done, it wouldn't be significant. So this is something that they are actively monitoring, and when they give consent to Tesco, for example, to build the flood defense, they factor that into their catchment-wide approach. And I think I can tell you from my experience, we wouldn't be able to get planning permission if there was a significant detrimental impact elsewhere on the catchment. Those impacts are very well controlled by the wider flood management strategy implemented by the Environment Agency. That's their remit. I think you have to think about the behavior of the wider catchment. So some places, if you are in a very constrained location, it will be like-for-like replacement, but some other places it doesn't always flood like that. So they're quite complex models that have been calibrated. We've done this in a number of places already, so this sort of sustainable drainage approach with an open water body being part of a drainage system. I mean, normally the flow coming from the stormwater network into the system, into the pond or the wetland is sufficient to turn over the water and to sustain water quality, brings enough oxygen, it has enough turnover to keep the water quality right. We haven't quite finalized the strategy, but if as we develop the design, we find that there is potentially an issue, we can always recirculate some of the water, and it's not a big operation. It's just a solar pump that takes part of the water and help recirculate the water, so you can maintain the water quality.
And a lot of the planting strategy will be to support that as well. So, for example, cleaning or aerating plants.
So yes, all of this material will be available. I'm not exactly sure myself where and how. You can also ask questions, and this is a way to keep in touch, because I think we very much value all those feedbacks. On the question of the EA, yes, I think that will be part of the planning submission will clearly make reference to that work. I think some of that work is already publicly available. If you look at the previous application, the Santon scheme, they had the report, the modeling report in appendix to the flood risk assessment. So there is already quite a lot of information online, and I think the EA will make this publicly available as well. So yes. That's a very good question, because you won't get those benefits if you don't maintain those features. We won't get planning if we don't have a plan. So there will be a plan. I can't really tell you now exactly what the plan is, because we haven't quite worked out who will be responsible for each element, but there will be someone responsible for the different elements. So the element in the courtyard will probably be the responsibility, probably be retained by human nature. Some of the other elements in the street might be adopted by the Highways Authority or by others. So there will be, and they're learning to deal with those things, and there is an upskilling in those different bodies to adopt surface SUDs, sustainable urban drainage features. So I don't have a detailed answer yet, but we will make a plan, and there will be a maintenance strategy at the back of the drainage strategy for planning, and we will work through this with East Sussex District Council, the lead local flood authority. That runoff will continue to do what it's currently doing, so we'll continue to run down North Streets along the curb lines, and it will get to the street. It will soak into the the rain gardens and some of the elements that we were talking about. And then in extreme events, it will contribute to the 100-year event ponding. But so there won't be it won't really affect. There is a route for it. The route will stay, or we're just factoring the volume in our calculations. So freeboard is an allowance above predicted level. It's an allowance above predicted level. So it's a difference between the flood defense level and the predicted flood level. So it's an allowance for uncertainties, or it's effectively some extra contingency. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you very much.